There was a boy named Luca who came to the zoo in a wheelchair. He'd lost both legs in a landmine accident in Angola. When he saw Rocket, he said, "He doesn't run anymore. But people come to him. Just like they do to me." Later, he wrote to us, saying Rocket made him feel strong again. There was an old tracker named Bawala, who had once killed a rhino in the 90s under orders from a rebel commander. He stood outside Rocket's enclosure and wept silently for half an hour. Then he asked to volunteer at the center. He never missed a day until he passed away in his sleep 3 years later. Rocket wasn't just changing minds. He was changing hearts. As the years passed, Rocket aged gracefully. He never fully returned to the playful, charging calf I first met in the Zambezi, but he settled into a kind of quiet leadership. His handlers rotated shifts, but he remained especially close to Miriam. She eventually went on to lead the education department at the center, giving talks to international delegations, always starting with the same story. "I once met a rhino who chose to trust again. He never let anyone touch the scar where his horn had been. But he allowed himself to be near people. He'd watch crowds from the shade of his favorite tree, huff softly at familiar voices, and sometimes shuffle closer when he recognized a ranger's scent. That was enough." In 2024, I retired from full-time service. I had spent more than half my life in the bush, patrolling, tracking, burying too many animals who didn't make it. But Rocket, he was one of the ones who did. Before I left, I spent one last morning with him. The sky was clear. The air was cool. I brought a few ripe bananas, which he still loved, even in old age. He took them from the feeding trough, then turned to look at me, his gaze steady, his posture upright. "You changed more than you know," I whispered. "You didn't just survive. You led the way." He didn't react, of course. He was a rhino, but I like to think he knew. Rocket passed away peacefully on May 6, 2025, just a month before his 15th birthday. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Zambezi Valley, the land where he was born. The place where he ran as a calf, where he fell, and where he began the long, hard road back. We held a small ceremony. Rangers, veterinarians, schoolchildren, elders, journalists, people from 6 countries stood in silence as the sun rose. Miriam read a few words. "Some lives are measured in years, others in impact." Rocket lived both. And then we released a flock of paper rhinos, handmade by schoolkids across Zambia, each bearing a message of hope. One simply read, "For every rocket, let there be a future." Now, when people ask me what Rocket means, I say this. He is proof that what is broken can heal. That what is wounded can lead. That even in the darkest places, where chainsaws scream and gunshots echo, there can be something stronger, the will to live, and the power to change. Rocket never spoke, but his silence roared louder than any speech I've ever heard. And I will carry that roar with me, always. By now, Rocket was fully grown, nearly 2 tons, muscular, but with a permanent scar where his horn once was. The horn had not regrown, and likely never would. A rough knob of tissue remained. But he stood tall. We received visitors from as far as Sweden and Japan. Scientists, journalists, diplomats. Many left changed. A few committed funds to new conservation programs. One anonymous donor funded a full-time anti-poaching unit under Rocket's name, an elite team stationed near the Zambezi with surveillance drones and community outreach programs. That was the unexpected part. Rocket had been maimed to make someone rich. But now, through his story, he was protecting others. He had become a guardian. I think about that often. How an animal who knew only trauma from humans now stood as the reason others were being spared. Rocket had survived brutality, but what he gave back was grace. There were still hard days. Sometimes Rocket would retreat, refuse to eat, or stare blankly into the horizon for hours. But then he'd rise again. Walk the perimeter, sniff the air, respond to Miriam's voice. He never gave up on us, even when we had every reason to believe he might. I remember one quiet evening, just after a thunderstorm. The sun was setting behind a curtain of gold clouds. Rocket stood near the edge of the enclosure, nose up, eyes closed, listening to the distant roll of thunder. He looked peaceful, strong, whole, and I realized, maybe he wasn't the same as before. Maybe he was something more. It's a strange thing, legacy. Most of us go through life wondering if we'll be remembered, if our struggles will mean anything once we're gone. Animals don't have that concern. They live in the now. They fight to survive. But every once in a while, an animal lives a life that leaves an imprint not just on its own kind, but on ours. Rocket was one of those animals. By the time a full year had passed since his rescue, Rocket had become something far greater than any of us imagined when we lifted his bloodied body into the transport crate that desperate day in the Zambezi Valley. He had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of what survival means when the world is watching. By late 2020, Rocket's story had gone global. The documentary that featured him, The Rhino That Wouldn't Die, was translated into 7 languages and aired across more than 20 countries. National Geographic did a special piece on the poaching crisis in southern Africa, with Rocket's photo on the cover. One eye squinting into the sun, the proud rise of his horn replaced by scar tissue, but with a posture that defied pity. He wasn't a victim, he was proof. That visibility changed everything. Conservation leaders used Rocket's case to lobby for tougher sentencing laws on poaching-related crimes. In Zambia and Mozambique, the minimum penalty for rhino poaching was increased from 5 years to 25, with no eligibility for parole. Local chiefs began speaking publicly about Rocket in community meetings, reframing the rhino not as a trophy, but as a guardian of heritage, an animal worth more alive than dead. One rural school near the South Luangwa corridor changed its name to Rocket Primary School, painting a mural of a rhino across its front wall, accompanied by the slogan, "His pain, our lesson." And perhaps most importantly, the Rocket Initiative was launched, an international conservation alliance formed by 5 African governments, 6 wildlife NGOs, and 3 private sector donors. The goal: fund, train, and equip rapid response anti-poaching units in 10 of the most vulnerable wildlife corridors across sub-Saharan Africa. The man whose bullet had nearly ended Rocket's life? He was caught in Malawi 2 years later and extradited under new cross-border wildlife trafficking agreements that Rocket's case helped inspire. He now serves a 30-year sentence in a maximum security prison. But amid all the policy changes, all the headlines and donations, it was the smaller things that stayed with me. She nodded. People protect what they understand. And Rocket has survived what few ever do. If his story can reach the right ears, if children, especially, see him not as a victim, but as a symbol, then maybe we have a chance to change minds. It wasn't without risk. Not many rhinos adapt well to life in captivity, let alone in close proximity to humans. But Rocket wasn't like other rhinos. So we began to plan. The zoo created a special exhibit space, not a display pen, but an open, naturalistic habitat where visitors could view Rocket from a safe distance while learning about his past. We worked with graphic designers, conservationists, and educators to build an immersive experience: photos from his rescue, a 3D display of a rhino horn, statistics about poaching, and an audio station that played recordings of real ranger communications the night Rocket was found. But we agreed on one thing: we would never let him be turned into a spectacle. This was not a zoo attraction. This was a witness to survival. Before we opened the exhibit to the public, we ran a controlled visit: schoolchildren from a local primary school in Kafui. 50 students, ages 9 to 13, arrived in 2 buses, many of them never having seen a rhino before. We watched from the observation deck as they moved through the exhibit. Some pointed in disbelief. Others pressed their hands to the glass wall, whispering. But it was the silence that struck me most. When they came to the part of the exhibit that told Rocket's story, complete with images of his injuries, the poacher's tools recovered from the crime scene, and quotes from our field notes, the children stopped talking. Their faces shifted. They understood. Afterwards, we held a short Q&A in the education center. "Why would someone do that to him?" a small boy asked. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because there are people who think a piece of him is worth more than his life." A girl in the front raised her hand. "But we can stop them, right?" And just like that, the spark we'd hoped for had been lit. Rocket began receiving weekly visits, small groups only, carefully monitored. Conservation talks were added to school curriculums. His story was picked up by regional newspapers, and soon, national media came calling. A documentary team from South Africa filmed a short feature on him, and Rocket became a symbol across the continent. The rhino who lived, the rhino who taught, but not everyone welcomed the attention. In the months that followed, we received veiled threats. One of our park rangers found a message etched into his car window: "Keep quiet. Next time, we finish the job." Another team intercepted a group of armed poachers near the Chisamba area with a hand-drawn map of our facility. We increased security. Cameras, fences, 24-hour patrols. Rocket was never left alone. But it reminded us of a grim reality: the war wasn't over. Poaching wasn't a chapter, it was a tide. And Rocket's survival was both a victory and a provocation. Still, we pressed on. In late October, Rocket did something extraordinary. He began to vocalize. Rhinos rarely make sounds in captivity, especially not those recovering from trauma. But Rocket began to make low-frequency grunts when familiar staff approached. It was as if he had found his voice again. When Miriam entered the enclosure one afternoon for a routine observation, he approached her slowly, then exhaled a long, throaty snort, followed by a nudge to her shoulder. "I think he's trying to say thank you," she said, wiping away a tear. He started responding to voices, especially Dr. Mwansa's. He would nudge the gate softly when he heard her footsteps. He recognized the keepers who brought his food. He became especially fond of a young volunteer named Miriam, who had a soothing voice and a calm presence. And slowly, Rocket began to heal, not just his body, but his spirit. What came next would turn Rocket into something no one expected. Not just a survivor, but a symbol. An ambassador. A living reminder of what we stand to lose if we don't fight harder. His second chance became a movement. It's been said that animals don't forget. Some scientists argue that rhinos, while intelligent, don't hold on to trauma the way humans do. But I've spent enough time around Rocket to know better. Pain leaves a mark, even when the wounds close, even when the bones mend. But just as pain leaves a mark, so can love. Patience. Time. Rocket had survived. But survival wasn't enough, not for him, not for us. We owed him more than stitches and fences. We owed him his dignity. And in some ways, we owed him a mission. After the first month at the rehabilitation enclosure in Lusaka Zoo, Rocket began to show signs that he was stabilizing physically. The infection had cleared. His appetite returned in full force. His weight climbed back steadily. But it was the emotional barriers, the distance in his eyes, the reluctance to approach anyone, that haunted us. He would stand still for hours, facing the wall, ignoring food until we left. Other times he would pace slowly, rhythmically, as if measuring the same patch of ground over and over. Once, when a helicopter flew overhead, he dropped suddenly to the ground and let out a low, guttural moan that made even the toughest handlers step away, shaken. It wasn't the sound of pain. It was the sound of memory. But then something changed. It started with Miriam. Miriam was a 24-year-old zoology graduate from Cape Town. She joined our center as a short-term volunteer, mostly to help with feedings and to log Rocket's behavior. But there was something in her presence, quiet, steady, non-intrusive, that Rocket seemed to respond to. She didn't force contact. She didn't try to feed him by hand. She simply sat nearby for hours, sometimes reading aloud, other times just watching. One morning, about 6 weeks after his arrival, she told me what had happened. "I was reading, and he just walked over," she said, wide-eyed. "He stood maybe 5 feet from me and just looked. Right at me. For a long time. Like he was trying to figure something out." From that day, it was as if a wall had started to come down. Rocket began acknowledging people. He would walk closer during feeding times. He responded to low, calm voices. When Miriam approached the gate, he would sometimes huff softly, not as a warning, but as a greeting. It didn't happen overnight, but it was clear Rocket was choosing to engage again, with us, with life. Around this time, Dr. Mwansa made a bold suggestion during a planning meeting. "He may never be able to return to the wild," she said. "But maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way. Maybe he has a different purpose now." There was silence around the table. "You mean," I started slowly, "turn him into an educational ambassador?" We radioed the emergency unit immediately. A mobile veterinary team was dispatched from Lusaka, and we began stabilizing Rocket with what little we had on hand: pressure bandages, IV fluids, a tarp for shade. Hours passed like minutes. The vet team arrived by helicopter just after 2 p.m., led by Dr. Chola Mwansa, one of the best in the field. "Still breathing?" she asked as she jumped down, gear in hand. "Barely," I said, "but he's still fighting." Rocket's face was swollen. One eye was shut. His side heaved with every breath. Dr. Mwansa administered anesthetics, painkillers, and antibiotics. We worked under the blazing sun, stitching tissue, cleaning the wound, trying to assess the extent of the trauma. The horn removal had been brutal, done with a chainsaw. From the jagged edges and burned flesh we saw. But the worst was the bullet wound. The projectile had missed his lungs by inches. Rocket was lucky, if you could call it that. By nightfall, he was sedated and ready for transport. We couldn't leave him out in the bush, not in that condition. Poachers often return to finish the job if they think an animal has survived. Plus, he'd never make it through the night without protection. A crate was flown in. It took a dozen men, a winch system, and everything we had to lift Rocket onto the platform and secure him. The next 12 hours were a blur: night helicopter, lights flashing, the rhythmic whir of the rotors as we flew to Lusaka Zoo's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. He was monitored the entire way, fluids pumping into his veins, breathing steady but weak. When we arrived at the facility just before dawn, he was offloaded into a specially prepared enclosure, a quiet space, with padded walls and soft sand underfoot. For the first time in his life, Rocket was behind fences. The next few days were critical. He went into shock twice. Developed an infection in the wound channel. For days, he didn't eat. Didn't move, just lay there, eyes half closed, groaning occasionally from the pain. But we stayed with him, 24-hour watches, monitoring, hand-feeding, changing dressings. Every time I looked at him, I saw the calf who once chased butterflies through the tall grass. And now he was broken, betrayed by humans. But Rocket wasn't done. On the 6th day, he stood. Wobbly, trembling, but he stood. The staff erupted in tears and cheers. It was a small miracle. From there, recovery was slow but steady. His wounds closed. His breathing improved. He began to eat again. Fresh hay, fruits, vegetables. He grew stronger. But something inside Rocket had changed. He was no longer curious. No longer playful. He didn't charge at things. He avoided eye contact. He flinched at loud noises. His trust had been shattered. I'd often sit outside his enclosure at night, just watching. Wondering, could he ever be the same again? Could he ever forgive? That question stayed with me for months. But we didn't give up on him. Rocket had survived what should have killed him. Now it was our turn to show him that not all humans wanted to hurt him. And over time, Rocket began to let us in. There are stories you never forget, not because they are beautiful, but because they change the way you look at the world forever. Rocket's story is one of those. My name is Joseph Mamwe, and I've spent more than 2 decades working in wildlife conservation in southern Africa. I've seen miracles, and I've seen cruelty. But few things affected me the way Rocket did. I remember the first time I saw him, not as the powerful, towering rhino he once was, but as a bleeding, broken survivor clinging to life under the wide African sky. But before we get there, I want to tell you about where Rocket came from. Rocket was born in the early morning of a warm September day in the lower Zambezi Valley of Zambia. His mother, Tamu, was one of the older cows in the area, fiercely protective and gentle all the same. His father, a dominant bull we nicknamed Ironback, had been seen courting Tamu several months before she gave birth. We rangers had been tracking Tamu for weeks before she calved. We knew she was due. I remember that morning clearly. It was calm, the sky was streaked with orange light, and we heard the cry of a fish eagle overhead when we spotted Tamu licking the newborn calf clean. He was already big for a newborn, sturdy legs, strong jaw, and a noticeable patch of wrinkled skin above his left eye. We called him Rocket because from the very beginning, he charged at everything. He charged at baboons, at wind-blown grass, even at a waterbuck once. It was all part of the play for him, but it gave us a glimpse of the kind of spirit that would carry him through events no animal should ever have to endure. For the first few years of his life, Rocket thrived. He grew fast. He was always a little more curious than the other calves, often straying from his mother to inspect a termite mound or roll in a patch of red dust. Tamu kept him in line, but you could see he was destined to be a leader, maybe even a dominant bull like his father one day. By the time Rocket was 5, he weighed well over a ton and had developed a majestic horn, long, smooth, and rising in a proud arc above his snout. It was a sight to behold, but in this part of the world, beauty can be a curse. That horn, a symbol of strength and ancient heritage, made him a target. We had seen the signs: snares in the forest, boot prints near the park boundary, the occasional gunshot echoing in the distance at night. Poachers were always a threat, but around the time Rocket turned 6, a new gang moved into the region, organized, ruthless, and better armed than any we'd faced before. They came in from Mozambique and moved westward, crossing into protected areas with impunity, bribing local villagers and intimidating anyone who stood in their way. On a Thursday in late July, we received a radio call from a patrol team near the Chiawa GMA. They'd found drag marks near a watering hole and traces of blood. My heart sank. I knew the pattern. This wasn't a predator kill. This was human work. We followed the trail for hours, muddy ground, broken branches, fresh flies buzzing in the late morning heat. And then we found him. Rocket was lying on his side near a small ravine, his breathing shallow and labored. His horn was gone, hacked off at the base. Blood soaked the ground beneath him, and a deep gunshot wound oozed from just behind his shoulder. He had tried to run, but collapsed a few meters from the water. It was the worst thing I had ever seen. I knew him, he wasn't just another animal. I had watched him grow from a calf, had recorded his first steps, his milestones, his independence. Now he looked like a discarded carcass. But he was alive. Barely.